Thank you, Deanne, for that scripture reading. So today is Pride Sunday, and that means that because we went through the Affirm process here at this church, this will be the first time that Lawrence Park Community Church has ever officially participated in the Pride Parade on Sunday. So I'll be going down, and perhaps some other people will meet me there, and we will be marching officially, and I will be having a banner in front of me, and we'll be there as a church, which is wonderful. And there'll be lots of other churches there, but not as many as could be there. There's still churches in this city and on this continent for whom homosexuality is a major problem. Just 10 days ago, the Christian Reformed Church, a Calvinist denomination, they decided that they would codify at their synod that homosexuality is a sin. Therefore, no same-sex marriages, no ministers could be homosexual. Homosexuality was condemned just 10 days ago at their synod. And there are branches of that church in this city. Just a little bit before that, in the United States, the United Methodists broke in two over this. They are no longer United Methodists. They're now actually disunited Methodists because a breakaway faction has formed another form of Methodism because, once again, homosexuality was the problem. The breakaway faction is a conservative faction that disagrees with the embracement of homosexuality by churches, and so they are going their own way. And the Catholic Church still has major problems with homosexuality. All of these churches point to the Bible as the justification for why they reject homosexuality. In the Bible, they point out that there are 6 passages which are used where homosexuality, or at least homosexual acts, are explicitly or implicitly condemned. There's 3 in the Hebrew Scriptures and 3 in the New Testament. But what all of the people who condemn homosexuality forget when they cite the Bible is 2 things. First of all, the Apostle Paul told us that the laws and the regulations which bound Jews didn't necessarily have to bind Christians. In the same section in Leviticus where it condemns homosexuality, it also says homosexuality, do that, homosexual acts are punishable by death, but so is cursing your parents. Yelling at your parents or wishing ill against your parents is also punishable by death. And that appears just a sentence later. Those 2 are of equal weight. And much later on, Paul said, you know what? We don't have to obey any of that stuff. We're not supposed to live by law. We're supposed to live by grace. We're not supposed to get into heaven by fulfilling a whole bunch of big list of laws and recommendations that the Hebrew Scriptures provided to us. After all, if you ate shellfish, you were unclean. If you were menstruating, you were unclean for a time before you could go to the temple. Paul said we don't have to listen to any of that. It's all pushed aside. And Paul said that because Jesus said it's not what goes into you or what comes out of you that is unclean. None of those physical things matter. It's what happens up here and how you act on it, which is what is unclean. So Paul said, don't worry about the Hebrew Scriptures. You can put that stuff aside. So Paul lived at a time when if Christians were going to have thoughts about homosexuality, it was going to have to come from the New Testament itself. And he lived at a time when homosexuality was not some minority interest, not some kind of deviance in the population, but rather he lived at a time when homosexuality was normal. Bisexuals, people had sex with people of their own gender. That was normal in Roman society. It was not frowned upon. It's considered completely normal in every part of society, from the top to the bottom. The Emperor Hadrian, for instance, he had an open public relationship with Antonius, a young man. This was in the early 2nd century. Hadrian and Antonius went together everywhere. Hadrian was in charge of the entire Roman Empire. Everybody knew what Hadrian did because all eyes were on him. And he had eyes and love for Antonius. And when Antonius died by drowning, Hadrian was so distraught with grief over this that he named a new city in Egypt after Antonius. And he also had him promoted to a god, because because you could do that back then. He had him deified. And that meant that there would be temples built in Antonius's name, and people would pray to him and pray for Antonius. So there was nothing secret about same-sex relationships at the time that Paul was writing. Paul wrote his letters in the 50s and 60s. During that time, Nero was the emperor. Nero had 2 husbands, one after another, and the second husband was given all of the rights and privileges of an empress. There was nothing secret about same-sex relationships in the Roman Empire, and if any Christian or anyone else had walked up to the Romans and said homosexuality is some deviant practice done by a small minority, they would have been laughed out of the room. Everybody knew that homosexuality was okay. Now, back then, how many people were homosexual? How many people were bisexual? How many people were gay? We don't know, because they didn't do surveys on that kind of thing, but we do. Here are the results of a survey that was released in 2021, which surveyed 27 countries all over the world. People who said that they like to have sex with people who are the same sex or of both sexes, both genders. Global average was 11%. It went from a low of 4% in Russia, where homophobia runs high and gets you arrested, so people may not have been telling the truth to the people who were doing the survey. In India, it was a high of 17%, and in Canada, it's 13%. These are people just saying who they like to have sex with. And so 13% said, nah, straight sex isn't my thing. I prefer to be bisexual or just have sex with people of my own gender. Now, scientists think that our sexuality is something we're born with. It's not a decision we make, it's something that we're born with. We're born this way, as Lady Gaga would put it. And that means that what pertains now probably pertained all through history. And in the Roman Empire, there's a pretty good chance that at least 13% of the population was gay, queer. Their sort of queer society, queer sexuality rather, is not exactly the same as ours. 2,000 years of history makes a difference. We're an individualistic society. We strive for equality among individuals, however imperfectly realized. The Romans didn't believe in equality at all. They believed in a highly hierarchical structure where at the top of the heap were Roman men, and Roman citizens, were supposed to have sex with people who had less power than them, people who could not vote. So that meant that they could have sex with women. That was okay. And they could have sex with slaves, male or female. So a Roman householder might have a wife and some children and some male and female slaves, and he could choose who he had sex with among the slaves. That wasn't considered adultery. He could have sex with men, sex with women, it didn't matter. And his wife couldn't complain. That was just him exercising his right to have sexuality. And he could also frequent prostitutes. Prostitution was legal back then. Prostitute was taxed by the state because it was such a big moneymaker. Same way that gasoline is taxed now, because everybody does it and it's a good way for the government to rake in some money. Prostitution was like that back then too. So they lived in a very different society than our own, but they were expressing queer sexuality in their own way. Now, there was one really big difference between their society and ours when it came to queer sexuality, and that was this. They didn't believe that your sexuality defined who you were as an individual. So in our day, we divide people into gay and straight, queer and straight. Back then, that wouldn't have made any sense. Think of it this way. If I walked into a room and I asked a group of people, who likes to jog? And they put up their hands. I say, who likes to do Pilates? And they put up their hand. They go, okay, people who like to jog, you can get pensions, you can get married, but Pilates people, forget it. Okay, we don't discriminate that way. What we do with our bodies for exercise is up to us. You like Pilates, do Pilates. You like jogging, do jogging. It doesn't matter socially. Although some people who run will brag about it. But still, overall it doesn't matter. It's not how we sort people. Same thing applied in the Roman Empire. They would have said, what do you mean? It doesn't matter who I have sex with. What matters is whether I vote, or whether someone owns me. Those things matter. But your sexuality wasn't a way that people were defined. Okay, so if that's the case, Christians say today that the Bible condemns homosexuality. And when Christians who feel that way want to provide proof, they look to the New Testament. So where do they find that proof in the New Testament? Well, let's look at the Gospels. There are 4 Gospels, those stories about Jesus. This graphic gives you an idea of how often words are used in the Gospels based on how big they are. So sin is very big in the New Testament. Lots of talk about sin. It appears over 1,000 times in the New Testament, in the 4 Gospels. Love is in second place, followed quickly by forgiveness, which is nice because that was the message that Jesus was trying to provide. Adultery's really small. Hate and poverty are there. But you'll notice there's no mention of homosexuality. Not once does Jesus mention homosexuality. It's simply not in there. Why is that? Jesus was constantly talking about the social problems of his time, which he thought were important. Poverty, cruelty, shunning people who were already marginalized, like people like lepers, and the poor and widows. He's constantly talking about people who are in trouble who need help, but he never mentions homosexuality. If homosexuality is a problem, nobody told Jesus. And since we follow Jesus, we should listen to that. Okay, so still, Christians point to the Bible and they point to the New Testament when they say that homosexuality is wrong. So it wasn't Jesus who said it. So who said it? Paul. The same person who wrote the scripture reading we heard today. Paul, who writes most of the letters in the New Testament, he said in 3 instances that homosexual acts were wrong. But why did he do that? Knowing that he was living in a society where homosexuality was so common, that queer expression was everywhere and legal and considered entirely appropriate. Why did he do that? Today's reading gives us an insight into the way Paul saw the world and will help us understand this. In the reading that we heard Deanne speak today, Paul draws a contrast between the flesh and the spirit. Right? In terms of the flesh, he says that if you follow the flesh, you will get into trouble. You should really follow the spirit, which will lead you into a different, better place. But what does he mean by the flesh? For us, we think of the flesh as our body, of course. So if you said, I don't want you to follow the ways of the flesh, we would think, oh, I guess you're saying that I shouldn't follow the ways of my bodily cravings. What does the body crave? Well, it craves food, craves drink. If you're an alcoholic, it craves alcohol. It craves sleep. Try giving up on sleep. Sleep wins, right? And sex, of course, right? We have sexual desires, which come and go depending on where you're at in your life, but it is one of our physical desires. But when Paul talks about the flesh, he has this long list that doesn't match that at all. So let's take a look at that list. Sexual immorality, sorcery, idolatry. These are all the fruits of the flesh. Enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, drunkenness, rivalries, and orgies. Sorcery. Do you feel a craving to do sorcery? Probably not, right? So many of those things on the list have nothing to do with the flesh as we understand it. Sorcery back then was illegal. The Roman Empire had outlawed it, but people still engaged in it. Sorcery was so that you could hire someone to cast a spell on someone else to force them to do something you wanted. Often it was used against business people. So let's say you've got a business and you want your competitor to do poorly, you would hire a sorcerer to cast a spell on them. So maybe their ships wouldn't come in or they'd sink and they'd run into hard times. That list had greed and theft on it because people shouldn't steal from others. That's a way of causing harm. You want something and you cause harm to someone else to get it. That list is full of acts which people engage in when they're feeling egotistical and they don't mind harming others to get what they want. So Paul is saying the ways of the flesh are really the ways of the ego, an ego out of control and ready to hurt other people to get what it wants. A very, very narrow perspective that doesn't mind other people suffering as you get your way. So that's what the flesh means to him. It's not this, it's up here. It's what Freud would call our ego. And what does he use as a contrast to that? He talks about the spirit. And what's the spirit like? The spirit gives you love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. The Spirit, in Paul's way of thinking, when you decide that you're going to live in Christ, you get to let go of all those anxieties which make you into a grasping ego that just wants to prove that it's worth it by taking things from others or satisfying yourself in orgies, which would have meant, having sex with slaves who don't want to have sex with you. But if you follow Jesus, he's saying that you can have all these good things. You can calm down. You can stop feeling like you've got to prove yourself and just relax and say, I am loved. You can take the slide down now, thanks. You can just relax and go, oh, I am loved. And in recognizing that you're loved, you get to calm down, get to peace out, and then you get to be in a position where you can share that love with others. You don't get that when you're worried about yourself. You don't get that when you're desperately trying to get something even at someone else's expense. No, the ways of the Spirit say, you're already loved. You don't have anything to prove. But in knowing that you're loved, and you calm down, now you can express that loving kindness to others. You can be good and faithful to others. So he's providing two very different ways of being in the world. An egotistical, harmful way, or a new way, which is loving and forgiving and helpful to others. So that's the contrast. And he's inviting Christians to go in this direction. So what's this got to do with sexuality? Well, in his other letters where he condemns homosexuality, he also talks about heterosexuality. And he says the best thing you can do to go on this path is to become celibate. In Corinthians, in his letter to the Corinthians, first letter is Corinthians chapter 7, he says, here's how it works. If you're single, stay single. Stay single. Remain a virgin. Don't have sex with anybody, because that will lead you on this path of peace and goodfulness and faithfulness. But if you find that sexual desire is filling your head and you really, really need to have sex, then don't start doing it with prostitutes. Don't start doing it with other people. Get married. Get married. That way, you can be giving of yourself to another person who also has desires. So it won't be you acting on your own desire. It'll be you helping someone else deal with their desire, and they with you. But even in marriage, try not to have sex a lot. Because sex will get you into that mindset where you'll be kind of he sees it as a sort of foggy-headedness, which will lead you away from God in that calmness. And marriage itself is full of distractions as you're trying to raise the kids and get them to places on time and deal with the needs of your spouse. He says, I don't want that for you. I want you to be calm. So try not to get married. But if you do feel sexual desire, get married. And once you're married, try not to have sex a lot. Actually, and he says this explicitly, try to reach mutual agreements with your partner for periods of celibacy so that you can pray a lot, so that you can be on this path and come together only when you really need to. And if your spouse should die, which of course back then the mortality rates were a lot higher, if your spouse should die, try not to get remarried and don't have sex when you're a widow or a widower. But if you're still feeling the stirrings of sexual desire, get married. But once you're within marriage, try not to have sex a lot. I'm not exaggerating here. If you read 1 Corinthians 7, you'll see it's all there. That was Paul's attitude towards marriage. And a lot of the people in-house here are laughing, and I suspect some of you at home are laughing. Paul is on a very different wavelength than we are today. And that's what you need to remember when people say that we should follow Paul when he talks about homosexuality. Because most of us would not take relationship advice from Paul on heterosexuality, so why would we take it from him on homosexuality? He lived 2,000 years ago, very long time ago. He was suggesting, he wasn't saying that sexual acts in themselves, where you put your genitals is particularly important. He was talking about the state of mind that any sexuality would generate in your head, straight or gay. So when people say, oh, those sex acts, no, you're missing the point. He was all about the state of mind. Earlier I said that scientists now think that, queer people are just a normal part of the human expression of sexuality, which means that this would be transhistorical. All ages have gay people in them. That's just the way human beings are made. That's the way God made us. So what happens with Paul and these instructions that people should be celibate? Since back then we know for sure there was a large proportion of the population, at least 10%, who were practicing gay people. So what did they think of what Paul was saying? Well, then as now, there's a tension between what your minister says and what people do. Right? Ministers often say things, but this is the gold standard, and people say, I'll settle for the silver standard, thank you very much. And we know for sure from what early Christians wrote that when they said that you should remain celibate wherever possible, only have sex for procreation, most people went, yeah, right. Thanks, but no thanks. Family sizes were high. Not every conception results, not every sexual act between men and women results in conception, so you can be certain that people were going home and having enjoyable sex, and it wasn't always for children. What about homosexuals? Well, some people listened very seriously to what Paul had to say about sexuality and celibacy. And in the 4th century, so that's the 300s, there was a movement of people who said, you know what, I'm going to give it a try. Men and women, gay and straight. They said, okay, I'm going to give it a try, and I'm going to try and be celibate. I'm going to devote myself to Christ as a celibate person. And this was the start of the monastic movement. So people left the cities and they went into the deserts of Egypt and Palestine to become monks, where they were expected to be celibate. So you had all these men out in the desert, and women too, to lesser numbers, all these people out in the desert singing psalms and praying all day long and making baskets and stuff so they could make a living. And then they would get together every week for Mass, like on Sundays, and they also sometimes get together for meals. So you'd have like 100 people, all who had devoted themselves to celibacy. But what happens then? You got a whole lot of men together and they're all celibate. They're not all straight, so what happens then? Well, Basil the Great is a major theologian who helped us figure out the Trinity, and this is what he had to say about when monks get together. He says, "It is frequently the case with young men that even when rigorous self-restraint is exercised, the glowing complexion of youth still blossoms forth and becomes a source of desire to those around them. If, therefore, anyone is youthful and physically beautiful, let him keep his attractiveness hidden until his appearance reaches a suitable state." So Basil's not saying that homosexuality is this terrible deviance. He's admitting it's perfectly normal, and he expects some of his monks to go, wow, that is one good-looking monk. He totally accepts that, but he's encouraging all of these men to be celibate. And so he goes on to say that, please, if you've got a particularly attractive young man, try to put a couple of old men between him and the next young man just to keep any trouble from emerging. They wanted, in these monastic societies, for everybody to stay celibate, but they didn't for a moment think that everybody was straight. That was normal back then. So what happened? Well, for the first 1,000 years of Christianity, these sorts of attitudes prevailed. But it wasn't until around the year 1100, in the Middle Ages, when the states start to rise up and become not just little fiefdoms, but actually big states like England and France. States get this idea that they should be able to rule over everybody and make decisions about what they do in their personal lives. And so states start passing laws, as do popes, where they start to regulate Muslims and Jews and the poor and gay people, and it's usually all four at once. The majority decides that the problems of their society are because of things minorities who can't defend themselves very well are doing. And so they become scapegoats. And if you attend my Bible class this week, you'll see how the way in which Paul's words over the years get interpreted in increasingly more hostile ways. It drifts from sexual acts to the entire being of being a homosexual person or a gay person. But for now, what I'd like to remind everybody is that on Pride weekend, when thousands and thousands of people are going to be walking with pride about their sexuality downtown, and they will probably look askance at people like me who will be wearing a collar walking with them. And for good reason, because Christians have caused so much trouble for gay people over the centuries, particularly in the last 1,000 years. We should remember that the few bits of the New Testament which condemn homosexuality also have ideas about heterosexuality, which none of us follow now. None of us want to have joyless marriages where sex is something we have 3 times over the course of 30 years just so that we can have children. Paul is not the person who should be giving us advice about relationships. So why are we taking his advice about homosexuality? Instead, we've learned a lot. We've learned that pleasure in a relationship, any type of relationship, any loving relationship that has a sexual component to it, that can be a place where love is expressed and reinforced. Paul asked us to try and pursue a path of love and goodness and forgiveness. And we've learned that that can be expressed in our sex lives with each other, that there is no contradiction. This contrast that he had between any type of sexual expression and getting to God is a false contrast. This is what progress looks like when we realize Paul was right about the path to God, because God is the source of love and forgiveness and compassion. And we can be on that path and have loving, fulfilling relationships with our partners of any gender. And so let us admit that progress is possible, that we can be proud of who God made us to be. And we can express that pride every day in the way that we love each other in any relationship we happen to find ourselves in, because we are all God's children and we are all blessed. Amen.